Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, representatives. Thank you all for allowing me to speak in this forum. My name is Robert A. Perillo Jr. I'm from Johnston, Rhode Island, and I am opposed to all three of these laws for a variety of different reasons. The ambiguity, for one, but mostly because each piece of legislation greatly infringes on our Second Amendment right to bear arms. Our Second Amendment right is very cut and dry and was not intended by the founders to be interpreted. Ladies and gentlemen, lest we not forget the reason why the Second Amendment exists. Yes, guns can be used for sport or for hunting, but the primary reason the founders included the right to bear arms in the Constitution was so that we could defend ourselves against injustices when our government fails us. Let me remind you that during the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s, many African Americans protected themselves from violent racists using firearms. During the LA riots in the 1990s, many Korean Americans defended themselves against threats of violence with firearms. And these are just a few examples. History tells us that anybody willing to take away our defense against tyranny has tyrannical motives themselves. This may seem like paranoia to many of you, but recall nearly every instance in the 20th century when governments went to lengths to disarm its citizens. It ended in mass genocide. In 1911, Turkey established gun control. From 1915 to 1917, 1.5 million Christian Armenians were rounded up and exterminated. In 1923, the Soviet Union established gun control. From 1929 to 1953, 20 million dissidents were rounded up and murdered. In 1935, China established gun control. From 1948 to 1952, 20 million political dissidents were rounded up and exterminated. In 1938, Germany established gun control. From 1939 to 1945, 13 million Jews and other undesirables were rounded up and exterminated. In 1956, Cambodia established gun control. From 1975 to 1977, 1 million educated people were rounded up and exterminated. In 1964, Guatemala established gun control. From 1981 to 1984, 100,000 Mayan Indians were rounded up and exterminated. In 1970, Uganda established gun control. From 71 to 79, 300,000 Christians were rounded up and exterminated. That's 56 million innocent subjects in the 20th century alone, systematically disarmed and subsequently murdered by their very own governments. This is the reason that our founders, coming out of a war against a tyrannical, unjust power, put the Second Amendment into place and were explicit that it shall not be under any circumstance infringed upon. They were aware that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And they had the foresight to understand that at some point in time, our government would become too big, too powerful, and our rights far too limited. The fact that our right to defending ourselves is now in jeopardy is absolutely frightening to millions of Americans who understand the history behind the disarming of one country's citizens. Many of you who showed up today to oppose this legislation. With that said, I don't believe any of the legislation put forth would have any impact on gun violence. I don't believe there are statistics to prove otherwise. In fact, I believe that if we encourage concealed carry instead of making it near impossible in this state to get that permit, gun violence would decline rapidly. I believe that if we eliminated gun-free zones, mass shootings would cease entirely. An armed society is a polite society. Those who want to commit acts of evil and mass casualty will do so regardless of what laws are in their way, but may think twice if they think somebody armed is in their way. In closing, passing this legislation will accomplish nothing except to infringe on the rights of hundreds of thousands of law-abiding citizens in this state, and I urge you not to pass it. Thank you very much for your time.